So maybe we can get into some of the language stuff and talk about,
Yeah.
if you're okay with that, language as a technology. Obviously, it's presented as a technology here because language is the thing that sort of flips the switch, unlocks the brain to perceive a new reality that's always been there, that the aliens can perceive, and presumably, obviously, the humans of 3,000 years in the future, referenced by the aliens, the reason that they're here to help us, already have access to. I mean, clearly they wouldn't have been able to probably, well, if they got it in the past, then presumably they would still have it. So there's some depiction, there's some sort of message that language itself is one of the greatest technologies we have. And so maybe it's more interesting to me because I'm an English teacher and I like learning about languages. Not that I'm necessarily a language expert and that I speak a lot of languages, but it's interesting to learn about language as an innovation and language as a kind of technology. People like Terrence Mckenna and Chomsky talk about it as it's really interesting the way that it has to be. So there's this thing called universal grammar. And you can think of universal grammar as the sort of underlying structure that all languages have. And then you say, okay, yeah, but then all languages are so different. You have English, which is subject, verb, object, and then you have Japanese, which is the other way. And, languages have so many, the structures are so different. The conjugations of the Romance languages, wow, they look so different. But the theory of universal grammar is that, in fact, language, or the ability to use language, the ability to acquire language, is a much more sort of bedrock thing in the brain. And that's pretty well proven out because any baby growing up in any culture learns that language natively very easily, but only does that at a certain age, sort of like they're pre-programmed at that age to pick up the pieces. But it's sort of like, imagine slots, like there are 4 slots. Here's the sentence structure slot. Here's the sound slot, the phoneme slot. Here's the placement of verb slot, the placement of prepositions slot. And the underlying sort of slot structure is completely unchanged, but it's sort of like one of those sets that you can assemble where when the frame is the same, you assemble it in this way, and it looks like this kind of creature or assembly that's different and has all kinds of crazy colors, and then you assemble another one, same basic armature structure, but it looks, again, totally different colors. But again, the foundation is the same, and it sort of gets solidified at childhood. So she understands this when she's communicating with the aliens, and none of them get that. They sort of, I don't even know if they're confident that she can achieve communication, but she wants to establish some basic things. She wants to figure out, she knows that they can communicate and they have language, because if they didn't have language, they wouldn't be here, because they wouldn't have been able to create civilization that would allow them to have technology that would allow them to travel through space. So they must have language. And then the question is that sort of fundamental structure of language, the universal grammar, is it universal as in the universe, or is it universal as in earthbound, meat creatures? So I think she's trying to establish if this is universal as in universal, and it clearly is. And what she does to do that is something that I did with my nephew during Thanksgiving, because he is in the process. He's 15 months old or something like that. So he's learning things, but he's not able to speak a lot. But he's learning the basic colors. And so he was able to point at something that's green and say green, and point at something that's red and say red, and point at something that's blue and say blue. But he wasn't able to, if you showed him something yellow, he wasn't able to say yellow. He didn't get yellow as a concept. So I sort of made it my mission during this 5 days that I was with him to teach him the word yellow. And it was very sort of interesting that at the same time as I was trying to do this, teach him the word yellow, that we watched this movie.
Denis Villeneuve would appreciate you teaching him yellow so he can watch his movies later and appreciate that color.
It's the same exact thing that she does with Abbott and Costello. So what she does to distinguish there is an internal structure that's there in the mind of every communicating organism that is able to distinguish the individual subjects, separate subjects, from the collective, right? Is able to distinguish one characteristic that is shared between two things, right, as opposed to the thing itself. So I showed him, for example, an M&M that was yellow, and he would point at it and just he would not say yellow. He would say something about that he wants it, right? And then he would ask for another one. And then I would get him to say yellow, and then I would show him another thing that was also yellow, trying to establish that I'm not talking about what this is, and I'm not talking about what this is. I'm talking about what these two things share. I'm trying to establish something on the sort of the deeper level of the universal grammar here, which is that these two things share this exterior that you're supposed to piece it together and listen to what I'm saying and copy my sound. And he succeeded within the first 2 days. And every time I showed him something, it was yellow. But then the first time that I had Mushroom, my wife, show him something that was yellow, he said blue. And I thought, wait a second, maybe he's associating me asking questions with the answer yellow to questions. So then I had to establish that. Then we went through that process. So then I had other people showing him things. Sometimes blue, we would look at blue, then we would look at red, and then somebody else would show him yellow, and he would finally say yellow. So we were sort of able to come to triangulate this fundamental thing, which is the identification of this particular characteristic of this thing, which is its chromatic signature, essentially, and not its shape or not what it is or not its function. And that was a very interesting process. And she does the same thing when she says, I'm whatever my name is, whatever her name is, I'm Ian. And they do the exact same thing with Abbott and Costello, even though, I mean, obviously they're not children, but it's the same premise.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
The universal grammar thing, that's a Chomsky, that's his kind of shtick, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's changed over time, but... And then McKenna talks about it as not how did language erupt into human culture rather than being this sort of slow thing, because from all available evidence it looks like this thing that erupted suddenly turned on. So how do you get that? How do you build up this component of language, the ability to use language, in this component? How does each of these evolve? But then it's a sudden thing. Well, how does that happen? So it's actually that the structures are all there, and it's more like the structures are all there doing different functions, and a switch is flipped. Somebody on mushrooms or something starts making sounds that represent something related to the hunt or however it happened, and once that light bulb turns on, it's everything was there, and it was just a matter of connecting this module to this module by one thread, and that had to happen mostly culturally rather than it being purely biological. The biological basis has been there forever, for millions of years, and it just had to come down to one dude who was like crazy enough to eventually just start shouting whatever words or songs about maybe just a single grunt that had a specific meaning that then made everyone else understand what he's talking about. And then suddenly, if you didn't have that innovation, you couldn't survive. Because think about someone today who doesn't use language or can't use language will never have children. So as soon as you have that switch flipped, it's like in the movie, the switch is flipped and you can now perceive time in this way. Once that innovation happens, if you don't have that, if you can't get on that wave and sort of grab that meme, then you can't procreate anymore. I think that's the idea.
Wait, if you don't jump on the language train,
think about someone today who can't use language, or just hypothetically imagine a person with no ability to speak or write. Or understand,
communicate at all,
or communicate. That person could not procreate, and so that tree that before was a viable tree, evolutionary tree, has to be immediately basically cut off, and the tree with the innovation, this new innovation that sort of spreads like smartphones. If you don't use a smartphone in your job, or you don't use a computer in your job, and you insist on doing everything by hand in a book, in a ledger, I mean, you're going to be fired. You can't make it. It's the same exact thing, right? So it's not like language evolved in an evolutionary process. It's like a light bulb went on, and if you didn't turn your own light bulb on or sort of jump on that wave, then you're going to become extinct.